The old man found the cave on a morning when the world had gone completely still. He was not looking for anything in particular. He had come up the ridge the way old men sometimes do, slowly, without urgency, carrying only a lantern and the particular kind of quiet that settles into a person after many years of living. The sandstone face rose above him in pale bands of rust and gold, and the entrance to the cave sat low beneath the overhang, half hidden by a curtain of dried brush that time had pressed flat against the rock. He ducked inside. The cold outside did not follow him in. That was the first thing he noticed. Not warmth, exactly, but the absence of cruelty. The air inside held itself steady, as air only does in places that have been carefully and deliberately shaped. He lifted his lantern and let the light move across the curved walls, the packed floor, the narrow channel cut along the base of one side. Whoever had built this had understood something most people never learn, that stone does not merely hold cold. That stone, given the right architecture and the right patience, holds heat long after the fire is gone. He pressed his palm flat against the far wall. Steady. Quiet. Alive in the way only rock can be alive. Slowly, without asking permission. Then the lantern caught something he had not seen at first. Near the back of the cave, at shoulder height, the surface of the wall changed. He stepped closer. 2 sets of handprints, pressed into the stone, not painted, not carved, but pressed into a thin layer of dried clay that had been smoothed over the rock face long ago. One set of prints sat slightly higher, the fingers longer, the edges worn soft by decades of air. The other set sat just below, overlapping at the wrists, the lines of the palms still sharp and clear. 2 women, 2 pairs of hands, pressed into the same wall, decades apart, as if each one had stood in this exact spot and reached up for the same reason, to leave proof that she had been here, that she had survived, that she had refused to disappear. The old man stood very still for a long time. He had come up the ridge looking for nothing in particular. He left carrying a question he could not put down. Whose hands were these? And how had 2 women, separated by so many years, come to stand in the same cave, in the same darkness, and make the same choice? The answer, as it turned out, began on a morning far colder than this one. The door shut behind her just after sunrise. Clara Voss heard it the way you hear things that change the shape of your life, not with her ears, but somewhere lower, somewhere without a name. The cold came for her immediately. It pressed against her coat, found the gaps at her wrists, climbed up through the soles of her boots. She did not move for one full breath. She stood on the frost-covered ground in front of the only home she had known for 8 years, and she understood that the home was no longer hers. Nothing was. Aldis Greer had not raised his voice. That was the thing about him. He never needed to. He was a tall man with pale, careful eyes and the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from certainty. He had stood in the kitchen doorway that morning with a small bundle in his hands, a fold of cloth tied with rough twine, and he had held it out to her without expression. "You gave us no son," he said. "The land stays with the name." That was all. Clara took the bundle. Inside was a small amount of money, enough to feel like mockery rather than generosity, and the short-handled shovel her husband had carried every day of their marriage. The blade was cracked along one edge. She had watched him sharpen it 100 times at the work table beside the barn. She did not look back at the house. She looked instead at the small figure standing in the upstairs window. Dark hair, pale face, one hand pressed flat against the glass. Nora, 8 years old, standing very still in the way children stand when they are trying very hard not to cry in front of adults. Clara's throat closed. She raised her hand. Nora raised hers. Then Clara turned and walked north along the creek path, because if she stood still one more second, she would walk back to that door and beg, and she had made herself a promise on the long night before this morning that she would not beg. She had 60 days. That was what the letter from the county office had said, delivered 3 weeks ago by a man on horseback who had not met her eyes. Aldis had filed a petition claiming Clara was unfit to raise a child, citing her lack of property and independent means. The court would review the matter in 60 days. Until then, Nora would remain at the Greer farm. 60 days to find a roof. 60 days to prove she was not what Aldis had decided she was. 60 days in the middle of a winter that had already turned mean and was only going to turn meaner. The creek moved under a skin of ice beside her, and the wind pressed down from the ridge in long, searching waves. Clara kept walking. Her lips were already losing color. The fingers wrapped around the shovel handle had gone stiff. She counted her resources the way a woman does when she cannot afford to feel anything yet. The money in the cloth pouch, a wool blanket rolled inside her pack, a bone-handled knife, a dented tin kettle, and the shovel with the cracked blade. That was the sum of everything she owned. She walked for 2 hours before she found the ridge. She had seen it before, in the late days of the previous autumn, when she had come this far to gather berries along the south-facing slope. The sandstone escarpment rose in layered bands of amber and rust, and beneath the overhang, set back from the wind line, a shallow cave opened in the rock face. She had noticed it then, the way you notice things you're not yet ready to need. The ceiling was solid. The floor sloped gently inward. The angle of the cliff caught the low winter sun and held it for hours after the rest of the valley had gone to shadow. She ducked inside and stood upright. The stone smelled like cold and deep thyme and something faintly mineral that reminded her, with a force she was not prepared for, of her grandmother's root cellar when she was a child. Her grandmother, a small, exact woman who had spent her youth in a hard country and never once wasted emotion, had taught her things that the women of this valley did not know and did not think to ask about. How stone breathed differently than wood. How heat moved through mass rather than across surfaces. How a shelter built with patience could outlast almost anything the sky sent down. Clara ran her hand along the cave wall. Then her lantern caught something near the back. She stepped closer. There, at shoulder height, scratched into the rock in careful, deliberate letters, was a name, Margaret. And below the name, a small diagram, lines and angles that had meant something to someone once, etched with the point of a blade or a nail. Clara studied it for a long moment. She did not understand it yet, but she recognized the intention behind it, the marks of a woman who had been here, who had thought carefully about this place, who had wanted to leave something behind for whoever came next. She pressed her palm to the wall beside the name, cold under her hand, but the stone did not shake. It did not lean. It did not tell her to leave. She picked up the shovel. 60 days, she said quietly, to no one and to everything at once, and she began. The first wall took 4 days, not because Clara was slow. She was not slow. She was the kind of person who measured twice and cut once, who studied a problem from 3 angles before lifting a hand to solve it. A habit her grandmother had pressed into her so early that it felt less like a lesson and more like the shape of her own mind. But the ground inside the cave had not been touched in a very long time, and the earth at its base was packed so hard that the cracked shovel rang against it like a bell rather than biting in the way she needed. She worked from first light until her arms stopped responding. The process was this: dig, carry, place, press, check. Dig the floor level where it sloped toward the entrance. Carry the loosened earth outside and pack it into a low berm across the bottom of the opening, so wind and melt water would have somewhere to go that was not inside. Haul flat stones up from the creek bed, one at a time, chosen by weight, and by the way they sat in the hand. Her grandmother had taught her that a good stone announces itself, that you can feel the difference between a stone that will hold and one that will crumble under pressure, and that this knowledge lives in the palm before it lives in the mind. Set the stones dry, without mortar, fitting edge to edge until the seams were too narrow for wind to find a path through. She did not think about Nora while she worked. She thought about nothing except the next stone, the next seam, the next problem the rock presented. This was also something her grandmother had taught her, though not directly, not with words. It was something she had absorbed through years of watching an old woman move through hard work without resistance, without waste, finding the path of least friction, not because it was easy, but because it was intelligent. On the 3rd morning, her hands split across both palms. She wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of her 2nd shirt and kept working. Bear arrived on the 2nd afternoon. He materialized from the direction of an old dump site near the wagon trail. A black dog, large-framed but thin in the way of an animal that has been surviving rather than living, with a broad chest and dark eyes that held an expression Clara could not quite name. Not pleading, not desperate, simply present in the way of a creature that has learned to ask for very little and has found that this is, in its own way, a kind of dignity. She had no food to spare. She said this to the dog directly. The dog sat down and looked at her. She said it again. The dog lay down, crossed its front paws, and put his chin on them with the air of an animal that has made a decision and is comfortable waiting for the other party to catch up. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to the wall. By nightfall, she had divided the last of her dried meat into 2 portions. She told herself it was a practical arrangement, that a dog would hear things she could not hear in her sleep, that the warmth of another living body in a small stone space was not nothing in a winter like this one. She told herself this with some conviction. She did not examine it too closely. She called him Bear because he was the color of river shadow and because the name suited the way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, as if the world would wait. In the days that followed, the valley watched from a distance. This was not unusual. Small communities have always organized themselves around the management of attention, deciding collectively who is worth observing and in what spirit. What was unusual was the quality of the watching. In the first weeks, it had been the watching of people waiting for confirmation of a verdict already rendered. She would fail. She would come down from the ridge and ask for a room, and that would be the end of it. The small satisfaction of being right about something is not a cruel pleasure. It is simply human. And this valley was as human as any other. But something had shifted since Edmund Hale had ridden up the first time and come back on foot the second. Edmund was not a man given to investing his mornings in lost causes. He was, as the store owner had once put it, with the precise vocabulary of a man describing a virtue he did not entirely share, constitutionally incapable of paying attention to something that wasn't worth paying attention to. So people began to wonder. The feed store became, as it always does in small places, the location where wondering was given a public form. The store owner found himself in the unusual position of holding two incompatible assessments at once. He had called the structure a folly to three separate people on three separate occasions, and three separate people had nodded in agreement, and now those three people were bringing it up again in a different tone entirely, not contradicting him, but noting that the wood smoke from the cave vent was remarkably consistent, remarkably steady, for a woman operating without proper materials. "Smoke is smoke," he said. "Consistent smoke," one of the three said. He changed the subject, but he looked up at the ridge that evening from his porch, and the vent smoke was rising thin and straight, with the particular steadiness of a controlled fire rather than an improvised one, and he stood there for a while longer than he had intended. It was on the fourth day that Edmund Hale appeared. She heard the horse before she saw the man, and she straightened from the wall and turned to find him sitting in the saddle at the base of the ridge, looking up at the half-finished stone front with an expression she recognized immediately. She had seen that expression before, on men who had already decided the answer and were watching events simply to confirm it. He was perhaps 60, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that had done serious work for serious decades. He wore a good coat, not new, and his boots were practical rather than decorative. He had the careful eyes of a man who had once trusted his own judgment completely and had been wrong enough times to revise that trust without entirely surrendering it. He swung down from the horse and walked closer. "Mrs. Voss," he said. His voice was measured. "Tell me you are not planning to live in this." Clara set down the stone she was holding and brushed the grit from her palms. "I am planning to survive in it." Edmund studied the wall. He walked to it and pressed his thumb into one of the seams. He moved along the line of it, checking the fit of 3 or 4 stones with the systematic attention of someone who had once been paid to know the difference between solid construction and dangerous illusion. "Stone holds cold," he said. "Stone also holds heat," Clara said, "if you understand how to manage the mass." He looked at her then. A full look, the kind that takes the measure of a person rather than merely registering their presence. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You have no timber for a proper frame, no mortar, no support structure. I have what the mountain has been using for several thousand years." He breathed out through his nose. Not quite a laugh, not quite dismissal. Something in between. He looked at the cave entrance, at the angle of the overhang, at the berm she had packed against the base of the wall. Then he looked at the shovel leaning against the stone, the cracked blade, the worn handle, the evidence of how much had already been done with very little. He did not say anything else. He mounted his horse and rode back down toward the valley floor. And Clara watched him go for only a moment before turning back to the wall. She did not have time to wonder what he thought. She had 37 stones left to place before the light failed. Lenora Fitch came 2 days later. She arrived on foot, which surprised Clara. Lenora was not a woman who did anything on foot when a horse was available. She was perhaps 45, dressed in the careful way of a woman who understood that appearance was a form of communication and had spent years perfecting the vocabulary. Her coat was dark and well-fitted. Her gloves were good leather. She picked her way up the slope with an expression of determined compassion that Clara recognized as something between genuine concern and social performance. Not dishonest, exactly, but not entirely honest either. She stopped at the entrance and looked inside. The cave by this point had changed considerably. The front wall stood nearly chest high, with a narrow doorway shaped in the east-facing side. The floor had been leveled and packed smooth. Along the rear wall, Clara had begun the slow work of shaping a masonry heater from the clay she had carried up from the creek bank. A low firebox with channels built into the mass, designed to move hot air through the stone before it escaped, storing heat the way a careful person stores provisions, deliberately, against the certainty of harder days ahead. It was not beautiful. It was intelligent. Lenora's nose moved slightly at the smell of damp clay. "People are talking," she said. "They usually are," Clara said. "They say you mean to stay the winter." Lenora looked at the heater. At the shelves, Clara had begun cutting into the side wall. "Clara, this is no place for a woman alone." Clara did not stop working. Most places aren't, according to most people, and yet here we are. Lenora stepped inside and lowered her voice, which was its own kind of performance. Intimacy deployed rather than felt. "My husband could speak to someone. There might be a room in town, somewhere proper, somewhere that a court might look favorably upon." She stopped. The words had said too much, and she seemed to know it. Clara set down the clay she was pressing and looked at Lenora directly. "You mean the custody hearing?" she said. Lenora did not answer, which was itself an answer. "I appreciate the concern," Clara said, and she meant part of it. "But a borrowed room in town is not the same as a home. The court wants to see that I can provide for Nora, not that someone else can provide for me." Lenora looked at the heater again, at the care of it, at the fact that this woman had managed to make the inside of a sandstone cave look less like desperation and more like intention. Something shifted in her expression. Not admiration, not yet, but the earliest edge of doubt. The doubt of a woman who has been comfortable long enough to forget what a person looks like when she is operating at the full limit of her capability. "If you need anything," Lenora began. "I'll let you know," Clara said. Lenora left the way she had come, picking carefully down the slope, and Clara watched her go with the particular weariness of a person who has spent her life being offered help that was shaped more like pity. She turned back to the heater and kept going. The crisis came on the 6th day. Not dramatically, not with warning. It arrived the way most serious things arrive, quietly, as a simple arithmetic problem with no good solution. She had eaten the last of what she had brought with her. The traps she had set along the creek had taken nothing for 3 mornings. The cold had driven smaller animals deeper and stilled the ones that remained. Bear had eaten the day before. Clara had told herself she wasn't hungry, and then told herself this again the following morning with slightly less conviction, and by the afternoon of the 6th day, she was sitting against the far wall of the cave with the particular lightheadedness that has nothing to do with peace and everything to do with the body beginning to negotiate with itself about priorities. Bear lay with his head across her legs. She looked at her hands. The splits across her palms had begun to close, but the skin around them was red and tight. She thought about the clay she still needed to mix. She thought about the 3 stones that still needed placing on the upper right corner of the wall. She thought about Nora's face at the window, the hand against the glass, the careful stillness of a child who has understood that something large and frightening is happening, and has decided that the kindest thing she can do for the people she loves is to not make it worse. 8 years old, and already practicing that particular sacrifice. Clara closed her eyes. Her grandmother's voice came to her then, not as memory exactly, but as the specific texture of a person who has been loved deeply enough to leave an impression in the mind that outlasts the body. A small woman, work-hardened, economical with words, but not with knowledge. She had taught Clara about snares not once, but many times, in different seasons, with different materials, until the knowledge sat not in Clara's head, but in her hands. Bent branch, loop of cord, the angle of the trigger stick, the place where an animal's path narrowed and it could not help but step where you needed it to step. Clara opened her eyes. She looked at Bear. "Don't let me sleep," she said. She went out into the cold. It took 2 hours to set 4 snares along the creek path, her fingers clumsy with the cold, her body spending reserves it could not easily replace. She came back to the cave and fed the heater one short, careful burn, just enough to keep the temperature from dropping into danger, and lay down with her blanket and Bear against her back, and did not sleep so much as hover in the gray country between exhaustion and consciousness. In the morning, 2 of the snares had taken rabbits. She brought them back and crouched at the cave entrance and looked at them for a moment before she began. And what she felt was not triumph. It was something quieter. The recognition that the knowledge her grandmother had given her was not ornamental. It was not the charming remnant of a vanished way of life. It was a living thing, functional and real. And it had just saved her. "The skills you need," her grandmother had once said, in a voice so matter-of-fact it had taken Clara years to understand what a radical statement it was. "The skills you need are already inside you. You put them there yourself, one season at a time, and no one can take them back." Clara built a fire in the heater and set the smallest pot over it, and began. That night, for the first time since the door had closed behind her, she ate a full meal. Bear ate beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. She was still sitting there, watching the fire settle, when she heard footsteps on the ridge path. Light, quick, not Edmund's measured tread. She went to the entrance and looked out. A boy of perhaps 10 stood 20 feet below, staring up at the cave with an expression caught between curiosity and the awareness that he had been seen. He held something in his hand, a stone, flat and well-shaped, the kind a careful person picks up without quite deciding to. He looked at Clara. Then he set the stone down on the path, very deliberately, and ran back toward the valley. Clara looked at the stone for a moment. Then she climbed down and picked it up. It was a good one. She could feel it. Load-bearing. She carried it back up and set it with the others. The cave by that point had become something she had not expected it to become. She had planned for function. She had planned for warmth, for structural integrity, for the specific thermal properties that her grandmother's knowledge had outlined in the particular way of a person describing something she had verified with her own hands in real cold over real winters. She had planned for survival. She had not planned for home, but home, she was discovering, was not a thing you planned. It was a thing that accumulated. It was the small groove worn into the earth where she always set her kettle, the particular angle of morning light that came through the eastern gap in the stone wall and lay itself across the floor in a bar of gold that moved over the course of an hour from the heater to the near shelf to the wall and then disappeared. The way Bear had established his sleeping place, not the warmest spot, not the most comfortable, but the spot nearest the entrance where he could hear the ridge before she could. The names she had begun to give to things, the working shelf, the reading corner, the fire-watching stone. These were not grand things. They were the small accumulation of a life being lived. And it occurred to her one morning, watching the light move across the floor with Bear's chin on her feet, that Aldis Greer had given her a cracked shovel and 60 days and the assumption that this would be enough to break her. He had been right that it was enough. He had been wrong about what it was enough for. Edmund came back on the 8th morning, not to apologize, not to offer help in the way Lenora had offered help. He came back the way a man comes back when something he has dismissed continues to occupy his thinking against his will. Early, on foot this time, carrying a canvas bag that clinked when he set it down on the rock outside the entrance. Clara looked at the bag, then at him. "You're filling the channels wrong," he said. "The angle's on your heater. The hot air is going to short circuit before it gets through the mass. You'll get 20 minutes of heat instead of 4 hours. She studied him. "How do you know that?" 40 years of working with what's underground. He unrolled the canvas and laid out a set of tools, small iron implements, a level, a scraper. "I spent 20 years in mines before the railroad. Stone is stone." "You told me stone holds cold." "Stone holds cold," he said, "and stone holds heat. Both things are true. The question is, which one you want it to do, and whether you've built it correctly." He looked at her steadily. "You haven't." "Not yet." There was a silence between them that was not unfriendly. "Show me," Clara said. What followed was not pleasant, but it was valuable. Edmund had the bluntness of a man who had spent most of his adult life underground, where imprecision had consequences, and politeness was a luxury no one could afford. He pointed out every flaw in the heater's channel design without softening it. He corrected the angle of the firebox straw with the iron scraper and a great deal of dust, and knocked loose 3 hours of Clara's work without apology. He replaced it in 40 minutes with something structurally different, and she could see, even before he finished, substantially better. While he worked, she watched his hands, the way he read the stone, the slight adjustments he made based on what he felt rather than what he saw. There was real knowledge in those hands. Old knowledge. The kind you couldn't learn from a book. When he was done, he packed up the canvas. "Test it with a small fire this evening," he said. "Feel the outer wall after 2 hours. If it's warm rather than hot, the mass is working correctly." He picked up the bag. Clara said, "Why did you come back?" Edmund was quiet for a moment. He looked at the wall she had built, the tight seams, the careful fit of stone on stone. He looked at the entrance channel and the berm and the drainage cut along the base. "Because I've seen a lot of construction in 40 years, he said, "and I don't often see work this stubborn." He said it neutrally, as if stubborn were neither praise nor criticism, but the accurate word. Then he left. Clara stood in the entrance and let herself feel, just for a moment, something close to relief. Not because she had been helped, but because she had been seen, But what she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was the thing that would change everything about this ridge, this cave, and the name carved into the stone. Edmund had been thinking about that name since the first morning he had ridden up and seen the cave entrance. Margaret. He had said nothing about it, but it had stayed with him the way a half-remembered fact stays, present, circling, refusing to settle until it finds the thing it belongs to. He was a man who had lived in this valley for 30 years. He had a long memory and the habit, common to people who have spent time underground, of noticing what others leave behind. He had known a woman named Margaret once. He did not say this to Clara. Not yet. He needed to be certain before he said anything, because certainty was what he owed her, and he would not offer her anything less. Nora came on a Tuesday. Aldis had allowed it. 1 hour, supervised by the woman who kept house at the Greer farm, a silent presence who stayed at the base of the ridge and looked at nothing in particular. Clara had known the visit was coming for 3 days and had spent those days trying not to build the moment into something too large for either of them to carry. She waited at the cave entrance when she heard small boots on the frozen path. Nora came around the last bend of the ridge at a pace that was not quite running. The gait of a child who wants badly to run, but has been told, explicitly or by circumstance, that she must hold herself together in front of people who are watching. She was wearing her good coat, the gray wool one with the 2 buttons that Clara had sewn back on twice. Her dark hair was plaited neatly. Her face was the face Clara had been holding in her mind for weeks now, like a lamp held against the dark. They held each other at the entrance for a long time without speaking. Then Nora pulled back and looked at the cave. Her eyes moved over the wall, the doorway, the shelves cut into the stone, the heater in the rear corner. She stepped inside with the careful attention of a person performing a real assessment. Bear appeared from behind the heater and sat in front of her with dignified patience. Nora looked at the dog, then up at Clara. "Is he yours?" "He decided to be," Clara said. Nora crouched and held out her hand. Bear sniffed it with great seriousness, then licked it once and sat back. Nora laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and the sound of it moved through the cave and off the stone walls, and Clara had to look away for a moment at nothing in particular. Nora stood and looked around again. She went to the shelves and touched the edge of one with her fingertip. She went to the heater and crouched beside it the way Edmund had crouched, examining, weighing. She was 8 years old, and she had always been this way, particular, serious about understanding how things worked. "Mama," she said, "it smells like Grandma's house." Clara turned away fully then, on the pretext of adjusting something on the shelf that did not need adjusting. After a moment, she said, "Yes, I think it does." They sat together beside the heater for the remaining 40 minutes of the hour, and Nora asked questions about the stone and the clay, and how the heat moved, and Clara answered each one, and Bear lay between them like ballast, heavy and warm and solid. Neither of them said anything about 60 days or county offices, or what happened if the answer came out wrong. When the hour was done, Nora stood and put her coat back on and buttoned it carefully, top button first, the way Clara had taught her. At the entrance, she stopped and turned back. "Are we poor, Mama?" Clara looked at her daughter, at the cave around her, at the walls she had built herself, at the warmth that hung in the air because she had understood the stone better than anyone had given her credit for. "No, sweetheart," she said. "We are rich in what matters." Nora considered this with the seriousness she brought to all things. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when an answer was good enough to keep, and went back down the ridge to the woman waiting at the bottom. Clara stood in the entrance and watched until the gray coat disappeared around the bend. Then she picked up the shovel and went back to work. It was on a gray morning 10 days later that Aldis Greer came up the ridge himself. He did not come alone. He brought a man Clara did not recognize, middle-aged, carrying a leather satchel, with the careful expression of someone employed to deliver bad news professionally. And he brought the sheriff, who had the decency to look at the ground instead of at Clara while Aldis spoke. Aldis looked at the cave, at the completed wall, at the doorway, fitted now with a heavy hide that moved only slightly in the wind, at the wood smoke rising thin and even from the vent cut in the rear of the overhang. His expression did not change. He had always been a man whose face moved very little. Clara had once thought this was strength. She understood now that it was something else entirely. The man with the leather satchel opened it and produced a document. He explained, in the tone of a man reading from a script he had read many times before, that a survey of land holdings in the area had established that the Sandstone Ridge and its associated structures fell within the boundary of the Greer property, as documented in a filed survey from some years prior. Any use of the cave as a dwelling was therefore a use of property that did not belong to Clara Voss. The county had been notified. The petition regarding the minor child remained active. The sheriff looked at the ground throughout. Aldis looked at Clara throughout. When the man finished, there was silence, except for the wind moving past the overhang. "You built something," Aldis said. His voice was the same voice he always used, measured, flat, certain. "I'll grant you that, but you built it on my land." He turned and walked back down the ridge, and the man with the satchel followed, and the sheriff last of all, his boots careful on the frozen ground, his face still angled away. But what Aldis did not know, what none of them knew, walking back down toward the valley with their document and their certainty, was that the boundary line on his survey did not match the oldest record in the county, that somewhere, pushed to the back of a shelf no one had opened in 30 years, a prior claim sat waiting to be found, that the land Aldis believed he owned had never been his to give or take. Clara stood at the entrance of the cave until they were gone. Then she went inside and sat down on the packed earth floor, with her back against the heater, which was warm from the morning fire. Bear came and lay beside her, his weight solid against her leg. She thought about the money, what remained of it. She thought about the sheriff's expression. She thought about the man with the leather satchel and the way he had read the document as though its contents were not the edges of someone's life. She thought about Nora's face at the window, the hand against the glass. She thought about walking down to the valley floor and finding Aldis Greer and telling him whatever he needed to hear. The thought sat in her chest like a stone. Possible, terrible, heavy with the weight of a thing you can do but cannot undo. Bear shifted against her. She looked up at the wall. The name was there in the stone where it had always been. Margaret. Scratched into the rock with patient, deliberate care. The diagram below it, lines and angles that she had been studying for weeks now, that had begun, slowly, like something surfacing, to make sense. A woman had stood in this cave before her. had stood here alone in winter, in whatever difficulty had brought her here, and had not left a name on a petition or a complaint or a record of injustice, had left only the knowledge itself, the shape of what she had understood, pressed into the stone for whoever came next. Whoever comes next, that name said. I was here. I figured this out. You can too. Clara sat for a long time. Then she stood up. She folded the document and put it on the shelf. She mixed a fresh batch of clay with creek water and dried grass and worked it until it held together. She carried it to the section of the rear wall that still needed sealing and began to press it into the hairline cracks with her thumb, one hand's width at a time, moving left to right across the stone. She did not yet know about the older survey, the one filed before Aldis's father had ever made his claim, the one that would eventually surface in a box of old records that Edmund Hale would find on a bitter afternoon several weeks from now, carrying it to the cave with both hands as if it were something fragile, his face set with a complicated expression that sat between anger and relief. She did not know any of that yet. All she knew was the clay under her hands, and the warmth at her back, and the name in the stone above her. She pressed her thumb into the next gap, and kept going. The letter from the court came on a morning when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the creek had stopped moving entirely beneath its ice. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and set it on the shelf above the heater and stood with her back to it for a long time, looking at the opposite wall. Lenora Fitch had submitted a written statement to the court, signed, witnessed, formal, attesting that the dwelling in which Clara Voss proposed to house a minor child was, in her considered opinion, unsuitable, structurally uncertain, inadequate for a child's health and development. The statement was careful and thorough and written in the particular vocabulary of a woman who understood how institutions think and had chosen, deliberately, to speak that language. The court had accepted it. Nora would remain at the Greer farm pending the full hearing. Clara stood with her back to the letter for a long time. Bear came and sat beside her. He did not put his head in her lap or make any gesture of comfort. He simply sat, close enough that his shoulder pressed against her leg, present in the way he had always been present, without theatrics, without demand, with the complete loyalty of a creature that had decided she was worth staying near and had not revisited the decision since. Outside, a wind moved through the valley below. She could hear it in the upper branches of the bare trees. A low, searching sound, like something trying to find a way in. She thought about Lenora Fitch, about the woman who had climbed this ridge on foot, who had said if you need anything in a voice that had sounded almost sincere. She thought about the careful gloves and the good coat, and the expression that had flickered across Lenora's face when she had looked at the heater, that earliest edge of something that might have become respect, and then had not. Had become instead a signed statement, a door closed with bureaucratic precision. Clara understood that Lenora had not done it out of malice. She had done it out of the thing that was worse than malice, convenience. Because her husband had a relationship with Aldis Greer that mattered more to her than an inconvenient woman on a ridge. Because it was easier to look at Clara's situation and call it inadequate than to look at her own situation and call it complicit. This was the hardest kind of betrayal to carry, the kind that came wrapped in the language of concern. Clara thought about going down to the valley. She thought about finding Aldis and telling him whatever he needed to hear. She thought about what that would look like, what it would cost, whether Nora's face at the window was worth the price of walking back through a door that had closed behind her. She sat down on the floor. Bear put his chin on her knee. She looked up at the wall, at the name scratched into the stone above the diagram. Margaret. Patient and permanent and indifferent to whatever was happening below it, the way names in stone always are. A woman had stood here before her, had stood here alone, in winter, in a difficulty that this cave had somehow not defeated, had left not a complaint or a plea but a diagram, knowledge, pressed into the rock, handed forward to whoever came next with the wordless faith that whoever came next would be able to use it. Clara put her hand flat on the cold floor. She felt the stone beneath the packed earth. Solid. Present. She stood up. She did not go down to the valley. She mixed clay instead, and worked it with both hands until it was warm, and carried it to the section of the lower wall that still needed finishing, and pressed it into the gaps, and kept going. Edmund came 3 mornings later. He arrived the way he had been arriving, without announcement, without explanation, carrying something useful. This time it was a coil of iron wire and a folded piece of paper that he held out to Clara before he had fully come through the entrance. She took the paper and unfolded it. A survey document. Old. The paper had the texture of age, soft at the folds, darkened at the edges. The handwriting was formal and cramped in the manner of official records made by men who expected them to last. Clara read it slowly. Then she read it again. Edmund watched her. "Where did you find this?" she said. "A box of old records, pushed to the back of a shelf where no one had thought to look in a very long time." He sat down on the low bench she had cut into the near wall and looked at the heater. "I don't think anyone had opened that particular box in a very long time." "This predates the Greer claim," Clara said, "by enough years to matter." He looked at her. "The ridge is on common land. Has been since before Aldis's father ever filed a thing. That survey he showed you references a boundary line that doesn't appear in any document older than it. Which means someone drew that line where it was convenient to draw it, not where the land actually sits." Clara set the paper on the shelf. Her hands were steady. She was not sure how they were steady. "The full hearing is still weeks away," she said. "Yes." "A document isn't the same as a ruling." "No," Edmund said. "It isn't. But it's something a court has to look at. And something Aldis Greer would very much prefer didn't exist." He was quiet a moment. "I'll take it to the county office myself if you'd like. There's a man there who has always taken the paperwork seriously. He won't be able to ignore this." Clara looked at the survey, then at Edmund. She had thought, when he first appeared, that he was the kind of man who would always need to be the one who was right. She had been partly correct and partly wrong, which was about as accurate as first impressions ever get. He was a man who needed to be right, yes. But he was also a man who could not leave an injustice alone once he had seen it clearly. He was doing for Clara what he could not do for Margaret. She understood this. She did not say it. Some understandings are kindest when they remain interior. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once in the way of a man who is uncomfortable with gratitude but not ungrateful for it. Then he picked up the wire coil and asked where she wanted the upper ventilation hook, and they spent the next 2 hours working in the particular companionable silence of people who have learned to trust each other's competence. It was Callum Drift who began appearing regularly in those weeks. He was a man of middle years, lean, with patient eyes, and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that most things worth doing cannot be rushed. He had taught the Valley's children for going on 15 years. He had been a widower for 4. He brought books, 2 or 3 at a time, stacked under his arm, and he always found a reason to stay longer than the delivery required. Something that needed looking at, a question about the heater, a thought that turned out not to be about the stated subject at all, but was simply the shape that staying took when a person was not yet ready to say directly why he was staying. Nora noticed before Clara did. Children always do. On one of his visits, after Callum had gone back down the ridge, Nora had looked up from the book she was reading and said, without looking up from the page, "He comes a lot." "He brings books," Clara said. "He has a lot of books," Nora said, and turned a page. Clara said nothing, but something in her chest did something she did not have a name for yet, and she was not ready to look at it directly, and so she did not. It was Callum who noticed the sky first. He had come up with a thin volume of natural history that had several chapters on geology. He had marked certain pages with strips of paper before bringing it, which was the kind of attention that requires paying notice to someone over time rather than in a single moment. He was showing Clara the page he had marked when Bear stood up. The dog had been lying beside the heater in his customary position of deep contentment, paws crossed, chin level. He stood up without any of the slow, stretching ceremony that usually accompanied his rising. He simply stood, suddenly, and turned toward the entrance, and the sound he made was not a bark, but something lower and more continuous. A sound of sustained attention, of a body on full alert. Clara looked at the entrance. The light outside was wrong. She went to the doorway and looked at the sky and felt something move through her that she recognized from a story her grandmother had told her once, only once, in a voice that carried the weight of real memory. Her grandmother had described a particular color that preceded the worst storms. Not the dramatic black of an ordinary bad sky, but something more ambiguous and more threatening. A yellowish gray, she had said, the color of a bruise on the 3rd day, the color of light that has been filtered through something that should not be between you and the sun. The sky above the valley was exactly that color. Bear paced to the entrance and back, paced again. He would not sit. He would not settle. "That's not a normal sky," Callum said quietly, beside her. "No," Clara said. "It isn't." She stood at the entrance for a moment longer, reading the pressure in the air, the particular stillness of the trees at the valley's edge, the way they had stopped moving, even as the upper air clearly carried force. Her grandmother had taught her this too, that the most dangerous storms announce themselves in the things that go quiet before the things that get loud. "I need to go down," she said. But before she did, there was something else she had to reckon with. 3 days before the sky changed, the court's preliminary ruling had arrived. Clara had read it standing at the entrance, one hand on the stone doorframe. Lenora's statement had been accepted. The petition remained active. Nora would stay at the Greer farm. She had sat with it alone that night. Bear had come and put his chin on her knee, and she had looked at the wall, at Margaret's name, at the diagram, and had felt, for the first time since the door had shut behind her, the genuine possibility of failure, not the abstract fear of it that had driven her through the first weeks of building. The real weight of it, specific and heavy and present. She thought about going to Aldis. She calculated the arithmetic of it. Surrender the cave. Surrender the ridge. Accept whatever terms he offered. Nora would be warm. Nora would be fed. The supervised hours would end. And what would Nora learn from that? What would she understand about who her mother was? Clara pressed her hand flat against the cave wall beside Margaret's name. Cold under her palm. The stone did not give. She had stood there for a very long time. Then she had mixed clay and gone back to the section of wall that still needed finishing and pressed it into the gaps and kept going. Not because she was certain, not because she had stopped being afraid, but because the alternative was a thing she would not give to her daughter as a lesson. That was the night she truly understood why Margaret had left the diagram, not as instruction, as example, as proof that the woman who stood in this cave before you had been afraid and had kept going anyway, and had wanted you to know it was possible. She went to every house she could reach before the light failed. It was not a short task, and it was not a comfortable one. The valley had a particular social architecture, who called on whom, in what order, with what degree of ceremony. And Clara had been outside that architecture for long enough that navigating it required deliberate effort that had nothing to do with direction and everything to do with the memory of how she used to belong here. Edmund came with her to the first 3 houses. His presence helped in practical terms. He was a man, and this valley still responded to that fact in ways that were not discussed but were very much operative. At the feed store, the owner listened to Edmund and looked at Clara the way people look at someone who has been designated as unreliable by a consensus they are not sure they formed themselves. "The animals are restless," Clara said. "The barometric pressure has been falling since yesterday. The sky has a cast that means animals are always restless this time of year," the store owner said. He was not unkind. He simply did not believe her, and did not believe her in the particular way of a person who has never needed to believe a woman's assessment of the physical world. "We've had bad winters before, Mrs. Voss." "This is going to be different," she said. He looked at Edmund. Edmund looked back at him steadily. The store owner put his hands in his pockets and said he appreciated the concern and would certainly keep an eye on things. At the Fitch house, the door did not open fully. Lenora spoke through the gap, carefully, in the way of a person who is aware that what they have done sits between them and the person they are speaking to and has not been acknowledged. "We're well prepared," Lenora said. "The house is solid." "The wind that's coming," Clara said, "is not interested in whether the house is solid." The door closed. At the church, the Reverend received her in the front pew with the expression of a man who has been approached by many people in distress and has developed a formal compassion that functions as a kind of professional distance. "Only the Lord commands the weather," he said. "The Lord also gave us the ability to read it," Clara said. He looked at her over his folded hands with the patience of a man who is choosing not to be offended. "We will trust in his provision," he said. At the Reverend's house, after he had sent her away with his words about God's provision, she had stood on the path outside for a moment longer than was comfortable. She thought about what her grandmother would have said about this exchange. Her grandmother had not been a woman who argued about theology. She had believed, practically without performance, that the same force that made stone also wanted someone to understand it. That the same force that made weather also wanted someone to read it. Observation was not the opposite of faith. It was how faith worked. She had not said any of this to the Reverend. It would have cost her more time than she had, and he was not ready to hear it. But she thought it. Standing on the path in the discolored light, with the sky the color of a 3-day bruise above her, and Bear pressing against her leg, restless in the way he had been restless since morning. At the Mill brothers' house, the older of the two had listened with the full attention of a man who has spent his working life at the edge of a creek and has learned to read water with the same kind of attention she brought to stone. He had looked at the sky. He had looked at Bear. He had asked 2 practical questions and received 2 practical answers. "How long?" he said. "I don't know exactly," Clara said. "Long." He nodded and went back inside, and she heard, before she had reached the path, the sound of shutters being reinforced from the inside. She did not stop to feel relieved. There was still Hartwell, and she was already losing the light. She tried one last door, old Hartwell's at the far edge of the valley, where a man who had farmed alone for 35 years had developed the particular stubbornness of someone who has survived too much to believe any given thing might finally stop him. She had seen him at the feed store twice, a lean man with a white beard who moved slowly and deliberately and greeted everyone the same way, with a single nod that acknowledged your presence without committing to any particular opinion of it. He opened the door just enough to look at her. His eyes moved to the discolored sky above the ridge, then back to Clara. Something in his face considered it. Then he closed the door again. Not rudely, just finally. At the edge of town, near the path that led to the ridge, a group of young men were stacking wood outside the smithy. One of them, the tallest, with the particular confidence of someone who has been told he is capable for long enough to believe it without testing it, looked at Clara and then looked away, and then looked back with a grin he shared with his companions. "Woman in the hole's scared of sunshine," he said, loudly enough. His companions laughed. Clara looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with pity. She looked at him the way you look at someone who is going to understand something soon and is not yet aware that the understanding is coming. She went back up the ridge. The storm arrived before midnight. It did not build gradually the way ordinary storms build. A darkening of clouds, a strengthening of wind, a slow escalation that gives the body time to calibrate. It came all at once and from everywhere, as if the sky had been holding itself back and had simply decided in a single moment to stop. The sound was not what Clara had expected, and she had expected something significant. It was not a howl. It was a sustained living roar, the sound of a force so large it had its own internal weather, its own variations in pitch and intensity, so that inside the cave she could hear it shift from one register to another the way a great river shifts between narrow and wide, each change carrying a different quality of violence. The temperature outside dropped to where skin would freeze in minutes. The wind came at 60 miles per hour, then more. The darkness outside the entrance hide was total and absolute and full of sound. The hide across the entrance pressed inward with every gust and then snapped back. Clara had braced it with 3 additional stones at the base and tied the upper edge with the iron wire Edmund had brought, and it held, moved, protested, but held. Bear sat at the inner edge of the doorway with his eyes on the center seam, his attention complete and unwavering, a guardian doing what guardians do. Clara fed the heater 1 measured burn. She had enough wood for 6 more. She had calculated this in the days before, and she trusted the calculation now, which was a different thing from not being afraid. The stone walls did not shake. This was the knowledge she had been holding through all the weeks of building, not the hope, the actual knowledge born of her grandmother's teaching and of her own months of observation. That sandstone of this thickness and this structure, shaped this way and sitting at this angle to the prevailing wind, would not shake, would absorb what the sky sent and distribute it through its own mass and remain. She pressed her palm to the inner wall, warm, steady. She was sitting with her hand on the stone when the first knock came. It was not a loud knock. The storm was loud enough that only something very deliberate would carry through it, and whoever knocked had understood this and knocked accordingly. 3 slow, hard impacts, evenly spaced. The knock of a person trying to be heard without sounding desperate, which is itself a kind of desperation. Clara went to the entrance and moved the hide. Lenora Fitch stood in the darkness with her daughter Emma pressed against her side. Emma was 7 years old, and she had been crying recently. Her face carried the blankness that comes after tears when a child has decided that crying is no longer useful and has moved into a different kind of fear. The quiet kind, the kind that sits in the eyes without moving. Lenora's coat was covered in ice at the shoulders. Her good leather gloves were soaked through. She was not performing anything. She was simply standing in the wind with her child and looking at Clara. "The chimney came through the roof," she said. Her voice was level in the way of someone holding themselves very carefully together. "The smoke, we couldn't stay. Emma..." She stopped. She looked at her daughter. She looked back at Clara. She did not say please, but her face said everything that please contains and more. Clara stepped back from the entrance. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." They came through. Clara dropped the hide back into place and turned to find Lenora standing in the middle of the cave, holding Emma against her, looking at the walls and the heater and the steady amber glow and the organized calm of a space that had been prepared for exactly this. Not for this storm specifically, but for whatever the worst might be, because the woman who had built it had understood from the beginning that the worst was always possible, and had built accordingly. Lenora did not speak for a long moment. Then more knocks came. The store owner, with his wife and his youngest child. Their roof had gone at the east corner where the old repair had never fully held. Then 2 brothers who ran the mill at the creek's edge, both of them half frozen and minimally verbal. Then a young woman Clara knew slightly, cradling an infant and moving with the slow, careful steps of someone who has been walking in wind long enough that her legs no longer entirely trust the ground. The Reverend, coatless. He had given his coat to someone on the path and would not say who. An older couple from the far side of the valley, who said nothing at all but held each other's hands and looked around the cave with expressions of transparent disbelief. 16 people inside the cave. Then, after a silence long enough that Clara had begun to think no one else was coming, one final knock came. Slow and deliberate, the knock of a man who was not asking for anything dramatic, simply making his location known. Clara moved the hide one more time. Aldis Greer stood alone at the entrance. No lawyer, no sheriff, no document in his hands. Just a man in the cold, with nowhere left to go, his coat insufficient for what the night had sent, his face carrying an expression she had never seen on him before. Not shame, not exactly, but the look of a man who has arrived at the outer limit of the story he has been telling himself and found nothing beyond it. He did not speak. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped aside. He came in without a word and found a place at the back of the cave, and he did not speak again for a very long time. 17 people in a space built for one. Clara organized. She did not think about it. The thinking had been done in the weeks of building, in the hours of measuring and estimating and planning, not for the best case, but for what the stone could actually bear. She placed people by body heat and need. The infant and her mother closest to the heater. The older couple on the flattest section of floor with blankets from her own pack. She cut the fire down to the minimum that would maintain temperature without consuming air too fast. She positioned Bear near the entrance where he could alert to any change in the hide's integrity, and Bear accepted this assignment with the gravity of a creature that understands purpose. Lenora helped without being asked. She organized the children in the far corner. She moved quietly and practically, and did not look at Clara while she did it, which was itself a form of speech. The storm outside continued its sustained roar. Inside, the stone held. The storm did not end that night. It ran through the darkness and into the next morning and partway through the afternoon of the following day. And in that time, the 17 people inside the cave learned things about each other and about themselves that no ordinary season of neighborly proximity would have taught them. Difficulty has a way of removing the furniture of a person's public self, the careful arrangements, the maintained distances, the performances of contentment or authority or indifference. Remove those, and what remains is considerably more honest and considerably more human than what was there before. Clara managed the space the way her grandmother had managed a kitchen during harvest, with economy and attention, wasting nothing, seeing everything. She rationed the wood in careful increments, burning short and hot rather than long and slow, so that the heater mass absorbed the heat and released it gradually through the stone walls long after the flames were gone. She kept the upper vent at the precise opening that allowed moisture to escape without sacrificing too much warmth. She checked the hide at the entrance twice an hour, reinforcing the lower weights when the wind found new angles to push from. The people watched her do this. After the first few hours, they stopped watching with the expression of those witnessing something surprising, and started watching with the expression of those who are learning. This was a different thing entirely. Edmund had arrived during the second wave of knocks, appearing at the entrance with ice crusted in his beard and a canvas bag over each shoulder, having made a trip back down the ridge and up again in the middle of the storm. He mentioned this only when asked directly, and then only in the plainest terms, as if it were an administrative detail rather than an act of considerable courage. He brought 2 blankets, a wrapped portion of salted meat, and a small sealed jar of rendered fat that could feed the fire if the wood ran short. He found a place near the entrance and stayed there for most of the storm, monitoring the hide, watching the stone above the doorway for any sign of movement in the overhang. He was simply vigilant, in the way of a man who has spent his life in places where the difference between attention and inattention was the difference between living and not. The Reverend sat with his back against the near wall and held a child on each side of him and told them a story about a very large fish in a very small boat, and his voice was different from the voice he used at the pulpit, quieter, less certain of its own authority, more present. Clara heard it from across the cave and thought it was the best she had ever heard him speak. The brothers from the mill reinforced the lower berm without being asked, packing additional earth against the base of the stone wall when the wind began finding a path beneath it. They worked with the efficiency of people who understand that in a crisis, visible effort is its own form of reassurance for those around them. Lenora organized the children, keeping them occupied through the long hours with stories and small tasks and patient attention that Clara recognized as genuine rather than performed. Lenora was not comfortable. She was cold, and her good coat was ruined, and the signed statement she had delivered to the court sat between them like something unaddressed. But she organized the children. She made sure each one ate something. She checked on the infant's mother twice an hour without being asked. Clara noticed all of this without comment. There would be time for words later, or there would not. Right now, the storm was what mattered, and the people in the cave were what mattered, and the fire in the heater was what mattered. Everything else could wait. In the hours before the birth, and after Emma had begun to speak again, the cave had settled into a rhythm that Clara recognized, not from her own experience, but from her grandmother's stories about times when a community had been forced, by circumstance, to be exactly what it claimed to be rather than what it performed. The older couple from the far side of the valley, the Wrights, their name was, had turned out to be people of particular depth and steadiness. Margaret Wright, who was perhaps 70 and moved with the care of someone who has learned to conserve, had been a midwife in her younger years. She took her place beside Petra without announcement or ceremony, simply appearing at the right moment with the practical knowledge of a woman who has attended many difficult nights and knows what is needed before it is asked for. Her husband Thomas said almost nothing. He was one of those men who has found that the most useful thing he can offer in most situations is reliable stillness, not absence, not disengagement, but the particular presence of a person who will not add to the chaos and will be there when the chaos passes. He sat near the entrance for most of the storm, close to Edmund, and between them they maintained a vigilance that freed Clara to manage everything else. The infant, small, wrapped in a piece of wool the young mother had pulled from her own coat, breathing with the focused concentration of a new person learning the mechanics of the basic task, slept through most of the worst of it. This seemed remarkable. It also seemed, in some way Clara could not precisely articulate, entirely appropriate. The youngest person in the cave, in the most ancient kind of shelter, doing the most fundamental thing. The brothers had learned in those hours something Clara had known for months, that stone warmed by fire stays warm long after the fire has done its work. They had tested this with their hands, moving along the inner wall at intervals. By the second morning, they had begun asking questions, not to her, not directly, but in the general direction of the cave, about how the channels worked, about the angle of the firebox, about why the temperature had remained steady when the fire had been banked for hours. Clara answered the questions as they came, without ceremony. Knowledge offered without ceremony is easier to receive. It was in the second night that Emma stopped speaking. The child had been quiet since her arrival, understandably, but quiet in the way of a child who is processing rather than absent. She had eaten. She had slept for a few hours against Lenora's shoulder. She had watched Bear with the focused attention of a child who finds animals easier to look at than people during difficult times. But somewhere in the middle of the second night, something in her went further inward. She stopped responding when spoken to. She sat with her knees drawn up and her arms around them and looked at a point in the middle distance that had nothing in it anyone else could see. Lenora held her and spoke to her quietly, and Emma did not respond in the way of a child who cannot hear. She responded in the way of a child who has heard something too large and does not know how to come back from it yet. Clara watched from across the cave. She had seen this before in a younger cousin during a winter when the cousin had witnessed something frightening and had gone to a place inside herself that no one could reach through the normal channels of speech and comfort. What had brought the cousin back eventually was not words. It was something else, something that did not require language. Clara looked at Bear. Bear was already looking at Emma. He had been looking at her, Clara realized, for some time, sitting at a precise distance from the child, close enough to be present, far enough to not impose, the distance of an animal that understands the difference between company that is wanted and company that is needed, and that these are not always the same thing. Bear, Clara said quietly. He looked at her. She tilted her head toward Emma. Bear stood, crossed the cave in 4 unhurried steps, and lay down directly in front of the child. Not beside her, in front of her, so that his face was at her level and his eyes were where her eyes were. He did not nudge her. He did not put his head in her lap. He simply lay down and was present, in that absolute and uncomplicated way of his, and looked at her. Emma looked back. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Emma unfolded one arm from around her knees and reached out and touched the top of Bear's head with 2 fingers. Bear did not move. Emma's fingers spread a little, pressing gently into the fur between his ears. Bear closed his eyes. Emma watched him for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that was very small, but was a voice, "Is your dog magic?" The cave went quieter than it had been. Lenora made a sound she converted, not quite successfully, into clearing her throat. The Reverend, who had been dozing against the wall, opened his eyes. Edmund stopped checking the hide seam and turned. Clara looked at her daughter's face. Nora, who had been asleep but wasn't anymore, who was watching Emma and Bear from across the cave with the expression of a child who has witnessed something important and is old enough to know it. "A little," Clara said to Emma. "I think maybe a little." Emma nodded seriously, as though this confirmed something she had suspected. Then she moved forward and put her arms around Bear's neck, and Bear bore this with the absolute stillness of an animal that understands it is holding something that needs to be held, and Emma put her face against his fur. After a moment, Lenora pressed both hands over her face. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said better. The birth happened near the end of the second night. Clara had noticed the young woman. Petra, her name was, a word that meant stone in some older language, which Clara found quietly appropriate when she first arrived. Petra was heavily pregnant, further along than was comfortable, and she had come through the storm with the grim, concentrated expression of a woman dealing with 2 emergencies simultaneously and addressing them one at a time. Around the 3rd hour of the second night, Petra looked at Clara from across the cave with an expression that required no interpretation. Clara went to her without making an announcement. She moved the Reverend and one of the brothers to the other side of the cave with a quiet word and a gesture, and arranged what privacy she could in a space that did not have much of it. Lenora, reading the situation instantly, organized a screen of blankets held by Edmund and Callum, who had positioned himself at the entrance in a way that suggested he was monitoring the hide, but was in fact simply creating a respectful boundary. What followed was several hours of the particular intense work that has been happening in difficult conditions since long before any of the people in this cave were born. Clara's grandmother had attended many births and had told her afterward, in the practical voice she brought to everything that mattered, "You do not need calm to do this well. You need attention. Keep your attention on what is happening and not on what you are afraid might happen, and you will find you know more than you thought you knew." Clara kept her attention on what was happening. She spoke to Petra steadily throughout, not with reassurance exactly, but with information. What was happening? What came next? What to do with the next wave when it arrived? This kind of speech is its own form of comfort, the comfort of being treated as someone capable of handling the truth of their own situation. Petra handled it. At some point during the long effort, Clara became aware that Nora was beside her, not in the way of a child who has intruded, but in the way of a child who has understood that something important is happening and has come to be useful. She handed things when things needed handing. She stayed out of the way when staying out of the way was needed. She was 8 years old, and she was steady. And Clara looked at her once in the middle of the worst of it, and Nora looked back with the expression that meant she was concentrating and did not want to be interrupted. The child arrived just as the storm's voice began, for the first time, to drop in register. It was a boy. He announced himself clearly and without ambiguity, and the sound of it moved through the cave and off the stone walls, and for a moment nobody spoke at all. Petra held him against her chest and looked at him with the expression of someone who has been through a great deal and has arrived somewhere unexpected and is still determining what to make of it. "What will you name him?" Nora asked. She asked it with complete directness, the way children ask things that adults circle around. Petra looked at the child, then she looked at the walls around her, at the stone, at the steady warmth that had held through everything the sky had sent. "Stone," she said, simply as a statement rather than a proposal. "His name is Stone." Nobody argued. It seemed right in the way that some names do, not because they were chosen carefully, but because they were the only accurate word for the thing they described. Edmund cleared his throat from behind the blanket screen. "Good name," he said, in a tone that suggested he was not generally given to sentiment, but was making an exception. The Reverend, on the other side of the cave, said quietly, "Amen to that." It was in the deep quiet of the second night, after Petra and Stone were sleeping, and most of the others had found their way to exhausted rest, that Aldis Greer spoke. He had been the quietest of the 17. He had found his place at the back of the cave when he arrived, and remained there with the contained stillness of a man who is present in body and somewhere else entirely in mind. He had not spoken to Clara directly. He had accepted the blanket she brought him without expression. He had eaten what was offered without comment. But in the deep part of the second night, when the storm outside had dropped to its lower register, and most of the cave was breathing the slow breath of sleep, he spoke. "Margaret survived that winter." His voice was very quiet. The voice of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has made a decision, not lightly, to put it down. Clara was sitting with her back against the heater, which was warm at the end of its evening cycle. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the middle distance and listened. "My father drove her out," Aldis said. "The way I drove you out." The same words, more or less. The same letter to the county office. The same arrangement with the right people. A pause. She came to this cave. She survived the winter. She built something. I don't know what she built, but she survived. And when spring came, she left this valley, and my father told everyone she had simply wandered off and lost her mind. Clara said nothing. He never admitted she was here, never admitted what she had managed. He died with it, and I grew up with a version of the story that had no woman in it at all. He stopped. "I drove you out because I knew what you were capable of, because I had seen enough of my father's story to know how it ended, and I thought, if I acted before you built anything, before you proved anything..." He stopped again. The fire clicked softly in the heater. "I drove you out because I was afraid of what it would mean if you survived." His voice was flat now, the flatness of exhaustion rather than coldness. "It would mean my father was wrong. It would mean I was wrong. It would mean that every decision this family has made for the past 30 years was built on a story that left out the most important part." Outside, the wind shifted, not gone, but turning. Clara pressed her hand against the stone wall beside her, warm, steady. She thought about what she might say, about the things that deserved to be said, the 60 days, the county letter, the document with Lenora's signature, the years of Nora's face at windows and supervised hours, and the particular grief of a mother separated from her child by a system operated by men who understood property better than they understood people. She thought about all of it. Then she said, "Margaret left a diagram on the wall. I've been building from it for months without knowing whose it was." A long silence. "She knew something worth keeping," Clara said. "She left it anyway, for whoever came next." She did not look at Aldis. She kept her hand flat on the warm stone and looked at the name carved above the diagram, patient, permanent, indifferent to whether it was acknowledged. After a while, Aldis said nothing more. He lay down with his back to the cave and his face to the wall, and whether he slept or not, Clara could not have said. It was Callum who found her there when the light came, sitting with her back against the heater and her hand still on the wall. He came and sat beside her without a word, in the way he had learned to do over the weeks of bringing books and staying longer than books required. His shoulder was against hers. The cave around them breathed the slow breath of sleeping people. Outside, the wind had dropped to something that sounded for the first time like it was finishing rather than continuing. His hand found hers on the stone. Neither of them moved. The warmth of the heater came through the wall at their backs, steady and patient and real. Not a flash of heat that burns bright and leaves cold in its wake, but the long, slow release of something stored carefully in stone against exactly this kind of night. Outside, the wind stopped. The hide at the entrance went still. In the silence that followed, the particular silence of a world that has just been through something and is taking stock, 17 people breathed together in a space built by one, and the stone held all of them, and the name above the diagram was the same name it had always been, and Bear slept with his chin on Emma's feet, and a child named Stone breathed his first quiet breaths in a world that had just gone, for the moment, entirely still. The morning after the storm was the quietest Clara had ever known. Not peaceful quiet, not the quiet of a morning that has nothing to say. This was the quiet of aftermath, which is a different thing entirely. The quiet of a world that has been through something large and is still determining what it has become on the other side of it. Every small sound landed with unusual weight. A boot on packed earth, the shift of a sleeping body, the soft exhale of a dog who has been awake all night and is only now allowing himself to rest. Clara moved the hide from the entrance at first light. The valley below was remade. She stood in the cave's opening and looked at it for a long time without speaking. The familiar shapes were still there. The creek line, the ridge across the valley, the arrangement of structures that marked where people lived. But the storm had laid a hand on all of it, heavily and without discrimination, and what remained had the quality of things that have been tested and found to be exactly as strong or as fragile as they actually were, rather than as strong or as fragile as anyone had believed them to be. Several rooftops had not survived intact. The meeting hall had lost its eastern wall's upper section. The fence lines that had defined the eastern pastures were largely gone, the posts pulled or snapped. Trees at the valley's northern edge had come down in a diagonal swath, their root systems exposed to the pale morning sky. And in the middle of all of it, smoke was rising thin and gray from the chimneys that still stood. Signals of life, of fire maintained, of people who had gotten through the night in whatever shelter had held them. Clara looked at all of it. She felt no triumph. She had expected at some point in the weeks of building and doubt and difficulty that a moment like this one would come with some form of vindication attached. Some clear signal that she had been right, and they had been wrong, and here was the evidence, visible to everyone. She had expected to feel the satisfaction of a person who has been doubted and proven correct. What she felt instead was grief. It arrived quietly, the way grief arrives when it is honest rather than performed. She felt it for the rooftops that hadn't held, for the families who had spent the night in ways that were cold and frightened and difficult in ways that need not have been, if different choices had been made. She felt it for the particular stubbornness of people who would rather be wrong in the way they understood than right in a way that required them to revise something fundamental about how the world worked. Edmund appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of something hot he had managed to produce from the small pot and the remnant of dried herbs in his pack, and handed her one without ceremony, and they stood together in the entrance and looked at the valley in silence. "Old Hartwell didn't come," Edmund said eventually. Clara closed her eyes briefly. "The Mill brothers went at first light," Edmund said. "The roof of the animal shelter had come down. He was inside it. He'd gone to tend the animals when it started and hadn't made it back to the house." The quiet of the morning pressed against everything. "He was a stubborn old man," Edmund said after a moment, not unkindly. "So are most of us," Clara said. She stood with that for a while. The grief did not go away, but it settled, took its proper place in the landscape of the morning alongside the smoke signals and the damaged roof lines and the 17 people beginning to stir inside the cave behind her. Not resolved, not explained away, simply present, which is the only honest place for grief to be. They emerged over the course of the morning, not all at once, but in the gradual way of people who are not quite ready for what awaits them outside, but understand that it is waiting regardless. Clara helped where help was needed, a shoulder to lean on, a word said at the right moment, the practical business of making sure each person who left the cave had eaten something and was wearing whatever layers could be found. Lenora was among the last to go. She dressed Emma in the additional wool Clara had pressed on her, a scarf, a second pair of socks, and then stood at the entrance for a moment after Emma had gone ahead down the ridge. She looked at Clara with an expression that had several things in it at once, which is the only honest kind of expression to have when a situation contains several things at once. She looked at her hands for a moment, the good gloves, ruined now, stiff with dried cold. Something about looking at them seemed to help her find the next words. "The statement I signed," she said. "You don't need to," Clara began. "I do," Lenora said. "I need to say it plainly, because anything less than plain isn't the same as saying it." She held Clara's gaze with the difficulty of a person doing something that is costing them something real. "I signed it because it was convenient for my husband's interests, and I told myself it was also my honest opinion, and I knew when I was signing it that the second part was not entirely true." She paused. "I will go to the court office today. I will withdraw the statement. And I will file a correction attesting that this structure is not only adequate, but is the reason 17 people are standing in this valley this morning rather than—" She stopped. "Rather than not." Clara looked at her. "And I would like to know," Lenora said with slightly less steadiness, "if that is something you can accept, not forgive. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking if it's something you can accept, which is a different thing." Clara thought about this for a moment, genuinely, actually considering it rather than performing consideration. Then she said, "Yes, I can accept that." Something in Lenora's face moved. She nodded once, precisely, in the way of a woman who is not going to cry in front of someone and has organized herself accordingly. Then she went down the ridge to find her daughter. Clara stood at the entrance for a moment after Lenora had gone, looking at the valley below, at the damaged roof lines, the smoke rising thin from chimneys that had held. She had not expected it to feel like this, not triumph, not even relief. Something quieter. Something that did not yet have a name, but that sat in her chest warm and steady, the way stone sits after a good fire, not dramatic, not loud, simply real and present and lasting. The Reverend came to Clara in the afternoon. He came without his formal manner, which was noticeable. He was a man whose formal manner was such a consistent feature of his presence that its absence changed the shape of him visibly, made him look smaller and more human, and in that humanity somehow more worthy of the role he occupied than he had been when he was performing it. He sat on the low bench near the entrance and was quiet for a moment. "I told you only God commands the weather," he said. "You did," Clara said. "I was not wrong about that," he said. "But I used it as a reason not to listen to you, which was—" He stopped and tried again. "I confused the source of the knowledge with its value. You knew something worth knowing. I chose not to hear it because of who was saying it, rather than what was being said." He looked at his hands. "I've been doing that for a long time, with more people than just you." Clara said nothing, because he wasn't finished. "I intend to stop," he said. It was simple. The statement of a man who has had a long and honest night and has arrived at a decision he will not be retreating from. I don't know if that means anything to you, but I wanted to say it plainly. It means something, Clara said. He stood. He looked at the cave, the walls, the heater, the shelves cut into the stone, the name above the diagram. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he should have seen differently from the beginning. This is remarkable work, he said. Not with surprise, exactly, with the particular quality of a compliment that has come too late and knows it. Margaret did it first, Clara said. I just paid attention. He left quietly. The store owner came with his wife and did not make a speech at all. He arrived in the late afternoon with a handcart, an unusual method of making an apology, but effective. On it was a portion of supplies representing, by Clara's quick estimate, roughly the value of what she had been overcharged in the weeks since she had begun buying small necessities from his store. He did not explain or annotate this. He set the handcart at the base of the ridge and looked up at Clara where she stood at the entrance, and he made a gesture that encompassed the handcart and was itself an acknowledgement, and then he went back the way he came. His wife lingered. She was a small woman with quick eyes who had always struck Clara as someone whose own opinions were regularly translated through her husband's voice, a kind of disappearance she had perhaps not chosen. She looked at the cave for a moment. Then she said, quietly, My grandmother built root cellars by hand. In the old country, before we came here, I always thought it was something that couldn't be done again. It can be done, Clara said. It just requires that you trust what you know. The woman looked at her hands. Yes, she said. I think that's right. And went back down the ridge. The young man from the smithy came at dusk. He came alone, which took more courage than coming in a group, and he came without the performance of confidence that had characterized him at the smithy door. He was simply a young man who had said a foolish thing in front of people who had laughed and was now standing at the base of a ridge in the failing light, which is a significant reduction in social comfort from where he had been. He did not climb all the way up. He stopped about halfway and called up to where Clara stood. Mrs. Voss. Yes. A pause. I said something stupid. Outside the smithy. Before the storm. Another pause. The failing light made everything simpler, which is one of the things failing light is good for. Your daughter was at the bottom of the ridge when I said it. I didn't see her. Clara said nothing. I'd like to say it to her, he said, that she should be proud. Clara looked down at him for a moment. Then she turned and said, Nora. Nora came to the entrance. She looked down at the young man. He looked up at her. Your ma is the bravest person in this valley, he said. I was wrong to say what I said, and I'm sorry you heard it. Nora studied him with the serious attention she brought to everything. Then she said, She's the bravest person I know too. A pause. You could learn to build something if you wanted. She could teach you. The young man looked surprised. Then something in his face rearranged. The particular rearrangement of someone encountering a generosity they did not expect and do not quite know what to do with. Maybe I could, he said. Aldis came last. He came the following morning, after a night that Clara imagined had contained very little sleep and a great deal of the interior accounting that serious men do when the ledger of their lives requires correction. He came alone and on foot, and he carried nothing in his hands. Clara was outside the cave, clearing debris from the drainage channel, when she heard him on the path. She did not stop what she was doing. He stood at the base of the ridge for a moment. Then He climbed. He stopped a few feet from where she was working and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the morning was very quiet around both of them. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "This was in my father's things," he said. "I found it some years ago. I kept it because I didn't know what to do with it. And then I kept it longer than that, for less honorable reasons." Clara straightened and took the envelope. Inside was a single folded page, the paper old and softened with age, covered in handwriting that was small and careful and precise. A diagram at the bottom, lines and angles that were immediately familiar, because she had been reading their duplicate on the cave wall for months. And above the diagram, a brief description in the same careful hand, explaining the principle of thermal mass in language that was plain and exact, and written by someone who had understood it not from books, but from experience. Margaret's handwriting. Clara looked at it for a long time. "She would have wanted you to have it," Aldis said. His voice was the flattest she had ever heard it. The flatness of a man who has decided to say the true thing and has had to remove everything else from his voice to make room for it. He met her eyes and did not look away, which was the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. Clara folded the page and put it in her pocket. "I'll make sure it's remembered correctly," she said. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked back down the ridge, and she watched him go, his figure growing smaller against the valley floor, until he reached the bottom and kept walking, and she watched until the distance made him just a shape, and then just a memory of a shape, and then nothing at all. She did not think she would see him again. She was right. The court ruling came 3 weeks later, on a morning when the first tentative edge of a different season was beginning to make itself known in the light. Not warmth yet, not truly, but the suggestion of warmth, the way light changes before temperature does, announcing what is coming before it arrives. Edmund brought the document up the ridge himself, which was unusual enough to tell Clara before she opened it that the news was good. He was not a man who made unnecessary trips, and his face, when he handed her the envelope, had the careful blankness of someone containing something they would prefer to express more freely. She read it standing at the entrance. The survey dispute had been resolved in her favor. The older document establishing common land status had been accepted by the county office, and the Greer claim had been found to be based on a subsequent survey that did not supersede the original. The dwelling Clara had established on that land was legally hers to occupy. The petition regarding Nora had been reviewed in light of the withdrawn statement and the updated assessment of the dwelling's suitability. The petition was dismissed. Custody of the minor child was confirmed as belonging to her mother. Clara read it twice. Then she stood very still for a moment in the entrance of the cave she had built herself, with the document in her hand and the morning light on the valley below and the name in the stone behind her. And she allowed herself to feel, fully and without management, what it felt like to have been right about something important for a very long time, and to have the world finally say so. It felt like the stone after a good fire, not hot, not dramatic, just warm, all the way through, steady and patient and real. Nora came that afternoon, not supervised, not for 1 hour. She came with her coat and her books, and Bear ran to meet her at the bottom of the ridge and escorted her up with the dignity of an animal resuming an important post. And she came through the entrance and looked at the cave and looked at Clara and did not say anything for a moment. Then she dropped her bag and crossed the cave and put her arms around her mother and Clara put her arms around her daughter, and the cave held them both. After a while, Nora pulled back and looked at the walls, the heater, the shelves, the name above the diagram. "Is this really ours?" she said. "Yes," Clara said. "It really is." Nora considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Then she went to the wall with the diagram and studied it for a long moment. "Will you teach me how it works?" she said. "The heat, how you made it stay." "Yes," Clara said. "I'll teach you everything." Callum asked her in the spring. He did it simply and directly, as a question between two people who had arrived at the same place from different directions and found on arrival that they recognized each other. He came up the ridge on a morning when the apple seedlings he had helped plant along the south-facing slope were showing their first tentative leaves, and he sat beside her on the flat stone she had placed outside the entrance, and he looked at the valley below and said what he had come to say. It was a quiet question, a serious one, the kind that does not require decoration because it already contains everything that matters. Clara looked at the valley for a moment, at the apple seedlings, at the smoke rising from chimneys below, several of them rebuilt in the weeks since the storm using techniques that people from the valley had climbed the ridge to ask her about, standing at the entrance with their hats in their hands, their skepticism mostly gone, replaced by the posture of people who want to learn something. She looked at Callum, who was looking at her with the patient expression of a man who has decided this is the right question and is comfortable waiting for the right answer. "Yes," she said. The wedding was held in the cave. This was Nora's suggestion, offered with complete practicality. It holds heat well, and there's room for everyone who matters. No one argued because it was accurate. The Reverend conducted the ceremony with the quieter, more present version of himself that had been emerging since the storm, the version that spoke to people rather than at them. Edmund stood near the entrance and held his cup of cider with the air of a man who is more moved than he intends to show. Petra brought Stone, who slept through the ceremony with the magnificent indifference of the very recently born. Nora stood beside Clara throughout. At one point, Callum's son, a quiet boy of 10 named Aldis, who had been watching Nora with the careful attention of a child who has identified someone interesting, leaned over and whispered something to her. Nora whispered back. Aldis nodded seriously. Clara did not hear what passed between them, but the expression on Nora's face afterward was the expression of someone who has just accepted a new and interesting responsibility. After the ceremony, when the small gathering had settled into the ordinary warmth of people eating and talking together, Nora came and stood beside Clara and looked at the name in the stone. "Margaret," she said. "Yes." "Did she ever know," Nora said, "that someone would come here after her? That what she left would matter?" Clara looked at the name for a long moment. "I don't think she knew for certain," she said, "but I think she hoped, and she left the knowledge anyway, because hope and certainty aren't the same thing, but you can act on hope. You can put it into the stone where it will last." Nora traced the letters lightly with one finger. "I want to understand all of it," she said. "Not just the heat, all of it. How to read the stone, how to know where it will hold and where it won't. Everything your grandmother taught you." "Then we'll start tomorrow," Clara said. Nora nodded with the particular nod that meant a decision had been made and filed and would not require revisiting. The seasons turned. The woman who had once been told she had built a folly on a ridge became, over the years that followed, the person this valley called when a structure needed understanding. This was not a dramatic transformation. It happened the way most real changes happen, gradually, through the accumulation of specific instances until the accumulated instances became a general understanding. The first winter after the storm, 4 families rebuilt their roof lines using techniques they had learned from watching Clara manage the cave's structure during the storm. The second winter, the Mill brothers added a thermal mass to their work building that kept the temperature stable enough to prevent the mechanism from freezing. A problem that had cost them 2 weeks of production every winter for as long as they had operated the mill. The third winter, the young man from the smithy built a structure for his sister's family that was still standing, unchanged and unrepaired. 20 years later, Clara taught all of it. She taught without withholding and without performance. She showed them how to read the lines in sandstone that indicated structural strength and the lines that indicated the opposite. She showed them frost depth and drainage and the angle at which a south-facing slope catches winter light. She showed them how to build a heater that stored heat in mass rather than burning bright and burning out. Knowledge offered freely travels far. It returned to her in unexpected ways. A letter from a family 3 valleys over who had built from a description passed to them by the Mill brothers. A child who arrived one summer with questions her father had not known how to answer. A woman who had heard about the cave and walked 2 days to ask about the channels. Clara answered every question. She had been given a diagram once, pressed into stone by someone who would never know if it was received. It seemed right to answer every question. Nora learned everything. She learned the way she did everything, with appetite and without stopping. By the time she was 12, she could identify load-bearing strata by touch as well as by sight. By 15, she had expanded and refined the diagram on the cave wall, adding her own observations in the spaces Margaret had left, extending what had been given to her the way knowledge always extends, outward and forward, finding new hands in every season. She taught Ellis. Ellis taught others. The knowledge moved the way knowledge moves when it is treated as something alive rather than something preserved. Bear grew old gracefully. He did not diminish in ways that were painful to watch. He simply settled gradually into a deeper version of his customary stillness. He slept more. He moved with more deliberation. He continued to position himself at the entrance in the mornings, facing outward, with the air of a guardian who has not relinquished his post, but has reduced his hours. In the evenings he lay beside the heater with a contentment so complete it was almost structural, a thing built into the space as surely as the walls. Emma, who had grown from the silent child of the storm night into a girl of particular confidence and directness, visited regularly. She always went to Bear first. She would sit beside him and tell him about whatever was occupying her mind, her plans, her disagreements, her opinions about the season, in the confidential tone of someone who has found a listener who will not repeat anything. Bear listened with unbroken attention. He died on a morning in early autumn in the way that old dogs die when they have been well loved, without distress, in his usual place, having simply reached the end of a life that had been, by any reasonable measure, a good one. Clara sat beside him for a long time after. Then Nora came and sat on her other side, and they stayed together in the quiet of the cave while the autumn light moved across the floor and the heater ticked gently with the morning fire. "He was a good dog," Nora said. "He was," Clara said. "He was the best dog." They buried him at the base of the cliff, beside the cave's entrance, where the south-facing light fell longest in winter. Edmund cut the stone himself, a flat piece of the same sandstone as the cave's walls, smoothed on one face. He spent an afternoon with a chisel and the particular patience of someone doing a thing carefully because it matters to him, not because anyone is watching. When he was done, he stood back and looked at it for a moment without speaking. The stone read, "He kept watch so she could sleep." Many years later, a young woman stood in front of a small gathering of people in a room that smelled of chalk and old wood and the warmth of a space where a great deal of thinking had taken place. She was Nora's daughter, and she had her grandmother's hands, broad-palmed, work-calloused, the hands of someone who reads the physical world through touch as readily as through sight. On the wall behind her were two drawings, framed and mounted side by side. The first was a careful reproduction of the diagram from the cave wall. Margaret's diagram, the original, with its lines and angles and the handwriting that had explained the principle of thermal mass in language so plain and exact that a woman alone in winter could follow it and survive. The second was the expanded version, Nora's additions, the observations built on what Margaret had left, extending the diagram the way a sentence extends when there is more true to say. These were made by two women, she told the gathering. They never met. They never knew each other. They were separated by decades and by circumstances I won't claim to fully understand, because the full weight of what each of them was asked to carry is not mine to weigh. She paused. But they left the same thing. They both left the knowledge. Not a record of what was done to them. Not a complaint. The knowledge itself. The useful thing. Because they understood, each of them, separately, across all those years, that the knowledge was more important than the story of how hard it was to have it. She looked at the two diagrams. This is what we inherit from them. Not the difficulty, not the injustice, though both of those were real. We inherit the knowledge they chose to leave, and the understanding that leaving it is a choice. That every person who knows something worth knowing has to decide what to do with it, and that the most generous answer, and the most enduring one, is to put it somewhere it will last. She turned to the wall and pressed her palm flat against it, between the two framed drawings. "The stone never lies," she said, "and neither did they." The old man who had first found the cave was a researcher of local history, a man who had spent 40 years documenting the structures and settlements of the Western Territories with the patient precision of someone who understands that the physical record is more reliable than the oral one. He had come to this particular ridge because of a reference in a county archive, a surveying record that mentioned in passing a dwelling of unusual thermal efficiency located in the sandstone formation north of the creek. The reference was brief. The surveyor had included it not because he thought the dwelling remarkable exactly, but because he was a thorough man, and thoroughness requires including things that do not fit neatly into the expected categories. He spent an afternoon inside the cave with his instruments and his lantern, and the particular quality of attention that a person develops after decades of standing inside places that have held human lives and learning to read what they leave behind. The temperature inside was stable, warmer than the air outside by a margin larger than he had anticipated. He measured the channels in the floor. He measured the heater channels in the rear wall. He took careful notes on the construction of the front wall, on the angle of the overhang, on the drainage cut at the base. Then he found the handprints, and he understood. Standing in the cave with his lantern and his instruments and the evidence of two women's presence pressed into the clay above the diagram, that he had found something more significant than an interesting thermal structure. He had found a conversation conducted across decades in the only language that outlasts the people who speak it. The language of things made carefully, with knowledge, and left behind for whoever came next. He sat down on the packed earth floor and stayed for a long time. When he finally rose and moved toward the entrance, he paused once more at the name carved into the stone. Margaret. Below it, the original diagram. And around it, in a different hand, careful, deliberate, extending the original lines the way a student extends a teacher's work when the student has learned enough to have something of their own to add. The expanded version. 2 women, 2 sets of knowledge, 1 wall. He pressed his own palm against the stone, beside the handprints, beside the name, cold under his hand, but steady. The stone never lies, he wrote in his notes that evening. And in this case, it tells the truth about something worth knowing, that knowledge survives the people who hold it, if the people who hold it choose to leave it in the right place. He published his findings the following year. The cave was preserved. A small marker was placed at the entrance, and in the cave on the ridge, which still stood, which still held the particular warmth of a space built correctly, built to last, built by a woman who had been given a cracked shovel and 60 days, and had understood that this was enough. The 2 sets of handprints remained on the wall above the diagram. One old, worn soft by years of air, one newer, the lines still clear, pressed into the same wall, decades apart. Proof that she had been here, that she had survived, that she had refused to disappear, and that the stone, patient, indifferent, present, warm, had held her, as it had always held, as it would always hold.